Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site, bettingangle.us, a free site. It is July the 5th, 2025. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, I have a theory about the United Kingdom. Right? The United Kingdom is a country that likes to root for underdogs. Right? They don't root for a then Prince Charles. Right? Now the current King of England. Right? No, they root for Princess Diana. Right? They look at fighters who have some holes in their game, and it's obvious. Right? But if the guy looks driven, if the guy looks like a warrior, they would rather root for that fighter over a fighter who seems blessed, seems to have better talent. So, Ricky Hatton, right? You knew Ricky Hatton didn't have much of a back foot. You knew Ricky Hatton got hit too much. You knew Ricky Hatton wasn't dedicated to the craft enough to stay in shape between fights. You knew he was yo-yoing in weight. But Ricky Hatton was loved. Right? There's only one Ricky Hatton the crowd would sing for his fights. He was a hero. Right? I believe Frank Bruno. We understood Bruno wasn't cat quick in terms of the hand speed. We knew Bruno was a slugger, but Bruno took shots too. You wondered how Bruno would do against the best at the time. But Frank Bruno was loved. Right? Let me just say, Anthony Joshua. Joshua barely won the Olympic gold. Right? Joshua was muscular, but you got the feeling he was still learning the sport. You never got the feeling he was defensively blessed. But yet Anthony Joshua could have been the King of England. Right? He was loved. Joshua was box office. Joshua has been a cash cow for years. Right? Financially, one of the most successful boxers I've ever come across. Here online, I couldn't even analyze Anthony Joshua, because if I said anything that halfway challenged him, if I said obvious things like Joshua should fight Deontay Wilder, Joshua should fight Tyson Fury, there was blowback, big blowback. Now, by contrast, let's talk about two guys that the UK was lukewarm on. Lennox Lewis. Folks, Lewis is the best heavyweight of his generation. I don't know what else to say. It's like you put all the heavyweights in a room from the time Lewis won the Olympic gold medal to now, he's one of the very best heavyweights. You knew Lewis was a great fighter. Right? A guy he beat at the Olympic Games was Riddick Bowe, who ended up winning the heavyweight championship. And you got the feeling Riddick Bowe wanted nothing to do with Lennox Lewis as a pro. Right? Lewis, of course, while he lost a couple of fights, he avenged both of those. He beat every man he was ever in the ring with as a pro. But yet, I can't sit here today and tell you that he was more loved than Frank Bruno in the United Kingdom. Lewis fought Bruno and beat him. It wasn't even one of Lewis's best fights, and he beat and inspired Frank Bruno. But the English people weren't in love with Lennox Lewis. Then you have Tyson Fury. Fury's another fighter on my very short list of the best heavyweights. The best heavyweight since the late 80s to now. He's not loved. Right? Here's a guy who spanked Vladimir Klitschko. Spanked him. Right? When Klitschko was riding high. Spanked him. then had some problems. Now, let's just say in some other countries, you see a fighter who's had some problems, and the crowd's compassionate toward that fighter. They'll support the fighter. I think one of the secrets to the love Ray Leonard had, and Ray was always loved, was the fact that, at the Olympics, Ray would carry around a picture of his young son. And Ray wasn't in love with boxing. Ray wanted to provide for his kid, though. Right? And you could tell that Ray wasn't in love with boxing. Fans gravitated to him. Then later, Ray had a detached retina, and that was practically a career ender. And fans followed Ray around. Right? Ray had surgery on his eye. We still wanted to see him fight Marvin Hagler. Right? Understand, in the UK, Tyson Fury got none of that sympathy. Right? Tyson Fury was on the outside. He was calling out people. Wilder's the one who picked up the phone. I know there's an alternative history of, money being offered and all this other stuff. But understand, Tyson Fury, from a boxing hotbed, had to travel to America to get a shot at the heavyweight title. Right? He beats, clearly, Deontay Wilder. They call it a draw. It wasn't like the country of England was up in arms over that. In other words, what I've noticed, and look, I've never been to the UK. I did have family living in the UK. I've never been to the UK. I'm speculating from across the Atlantic Ocean. But just to understand, I believe in the UK, if you're too dominant, you get blowback. Right? Folks want the hard luck story. They don't want the story where, you're Lennox Lewis, you're Tyson Fury, right? You're destined for the Hall of Fame. You have Hall of Fame skills. They don't want that story. Too dominant doesn't sell tickets. Let me also say, too, with guys who are too dominant, when something bad happens to them, the 20% that's always against you, but they're quiet when things are going well. They will take over the public dialogue when things go bad. Right? So both Tyson Fury had some rough moments. You would think that, Lewis never had other fights other than Oliver McCall and Hasim Rahman. Right? You would think that Tyson Fury was getting dropped in every fight. Right? You talk about Tyson Fury and people will talk about John McDermott. Right? That fight. Steve Cunningham. I plead guilty. I'm one of those people who will, point out the rough moments a great fighter has had. But at the end of the day, I appreciate the great fighter. I'm not sure if the UK does as much. Right? Joe Calzaghe was probably never more compelling than when he gets knocked down. And the Roy Jones fight, that was a fake knockdown, right? Jones hits him with a forearm. Or the Bernard Hopkins fight. Right? People looked at Calzaghe against Chris Eubank and they were rooting for Eubank. Right? It's not really until the Kessler fight where people actually started giving Calzaghe credit. Right? You had an unbeaten fighter, and it wasn't until Calzaghe actually started deconstructing Kessler in the second half of that fight that the UK suddenly woke up to the fact that, wow, our unbeaten fighter might actually be the best in the world. Well, let's talk about one of the UK's best fighters. I get a lot of heat when I mention this guy. One time I made a video, I didn't even think it was controversial. And someone in the comment section said nobody loves Hamza Shiraz more than Dwyer. And I thought, really, am I giving undeserved praise to Hamza Shiraz? By the way, folks, he's still unbeaten as I make this video. So there are two fights that pop up whenever you talk about Hamza Shiraz. Right? One is, of course, the Carlos Adames fight. People in the UK were upset with the outcome of that fight because they thought their fighter lost that fight. That's how ridiculous the UK is. Right? Now, I give the UK credit. They believe in fairness. Right? But let's just say, folks, I don't know how you could look at the early part of that fight and feel that Sheeraz wasn't dominating. Sure, Adames, champion, comes back second half of the fight. I liked the outcome, even though I thought Sheeraz won the fight, even though I had money on Sheeraz, right? So I lost money on that fight, right? I should have thought about the draw. But you know what I believe. If you're going to beat the champ, you have to beat him to take his title. This can't be a horse race photo finish. We can't be looking at the film and saying, who edged this? Right? I believe Sheeraz is a dominant enough fighter where he's going to clearly win a title. Right? My attitude is, hey, if there's doubt about who won, then I would rather my guy, get a draw in a close fight where I think he beat the champ. Right? Well, the Carlos Adames fight will live in history. Right? Sheeraz, of course, has moved up to 168 now. The other fight is in my favorites folder right now. You need to look at it. It's his fight against Francisco Emmanuel Torres. Now, why do people talk about this fight? It's because Sheeraz hits the canvas in the fight. Right now, folks, all I can say is, life's about different interpretations of the same event. Right? The public sees one fight, I see another fight. What I want people to do is to understand a few things before we talk about this fight. Edgar Berlanga started his career, New Yorker, started his career with 16 straight first-round knockouts. Right? 16 straight first-round knockouts. Right? He was a big deal in New York City. He was box office, Puerto Rican, in New York City, getting stoppages in a boxing town. Right? Great gyms in New York. Fraser Ali, the first fight took place at Madison Square Garden. You have Barclays. Deontay Wilder's had several big fights at Barclays. George Foreman fought Joe Frazier. The rematch, I believe, in Nassau Coliseum. Don't overlook that venue. Right? You have a bunch of fighters from, New Jersey, from Long Island, right? Joe Smith, Chris Algieri. Of course, Brooklyn is its own world. Tyson, Riddick Bowe, Shannon, Briggs. What other, borough anywhere would have three heavyweight champions, right? And of course, certain gyms are legendary, Gleason's gym and stuff like that. So New York City is, a boxing hotbed. Now understand what Sheeraz is trying to do here. He's fighting a New York fighter with buzz. He's fighting Edgar Berlanga, who's certain to have a huge fan contingent at the fight in Queens. He's fighting Berlanga in New York City. He's trying to come in the front door. to beat Edgar Berlanga, right? He's not trying to come in some side door. He's not hoping the judges are generous and stuff like that. No, no, no. First fight at 168. He's taking on a guy whose only loss was to Canelo. He's taking on a guy who's big for 168, right? Understand, Berlanga's had problems making 168. Right? That's what Sheeraz is doing. An ocean away from his home country. Right? Well, what I want people to do is to look at this film. Understand, this is one of the notorious fights that he's been in. This is kind of like his Steve Cunningham fight. Right? What I want people to see, first of all, is that Hamza Shiraz has one of the best jabs in the sport. Okay? I don't know how else to put it. It's one of the best jabs in the sport. He has a secret too. Like Oscar De La Hoya, who had that 45. Berlanga's actually a southpaw fighting orthodox. So that jab is his dominant hand. So, the second round of this fight, he's fighting a guy, Francisco Emmanuel Torres, let's give him credit, who has ring coverage. So you're talking about two guys fighting at 160, and they can actually be an arm's length away. They're comfortable an arm's length away. I don't believe Edgar Berlanga has ring coverage. Right? So just understand, you get to the second round, and Sheeraz hits Torres with a jab that literally stops Torres in his tracks. Right? Until that point, Torres is looking decent. Then he gets hit with a jab, and you understand how stiff the jab is. Sheeraz has a poker face. Right? Sheeraz throws a jab that looks ordinary. The only way to judge his jab is by the reaction of the person he's hitting. So understand, Sheeraz hits him with a jab, and literally Torres backs up. You would have thought Sheeraz hit him with a straight right hand. But understand, the wrinkle is, in essence, Sheeraz did, because Sheeraz's jab is with his dominant hand. Right? So then, of course, you get to the third round, and Sheeraz tops himself. Sheeraz throws a jab. It looks pedestrian. There's no wind-up with the jab, because Sheeraz has built-in leverage. This is the tall guy who knows how to balance himself to throw his shots. So the jab looks pedestrian. Folks, it's so beautiful that it knocks down Francisco Torres. Now, of course, no one remembers. No one remembers that part of the fight. What they remember is Sheeraz then deciding that he wants a stoppage. So Sheeraz goes hunting. Torres, KG vet, Torres is on his back foot. As Sheeraz comes in recklessly, thinking, I've hurt this man. Now it's time to stop him. He gets hit with a right hand from Francisco Torres and goes down. That's what people remember. Sheeraz hitting the canvas. So Sheeraz gets off the canvas. And let me just say, what I want you to do is to look at the chopping right hands that Sheeraz throws. Right? If there is a problem with Sheeraz, and I just don't think Berlanga is advanced enough to take advantage of this, is that while Thomas Hearns could hit you with a long overhand right, In other words, Hearns, a tall guy, is leveraging his height, using his ring coverage on both sides, right? Hearns had the jab, Hearns had the long right hand. Shiraz prefers to hit you with a shorter right hand, not an overhand right, but a right hook, which brings Shiraz into the pocket. So if he's fighting an advanced fighter, right, who's observing punch pattern, right, if he was fighting the equivalent of Shakur Stevenson at 168, right, an opponent might take chances thinking that Shiraz can't land with the kind of authority that he could land a chopping right hand. That since Shiraz is inverted, the idea would be that he might not be able to land a overhand straight right. Right? Think De La Hoya. De La Hoya would throw that left at a 45-degree angle. De La Hoya himself didn't have that long right hand, a reliable long right hand. That's one of the secrets in his fight against Floyd Mayweather, right? I've said many times, Mayweather's biggest asset was his thought process, his mental approach to the game, right? So there's a moment in that fight where De La Hoya gets Mayweather over by the ropes. Mayweather lifts his defense and is ready to block the left hands that De La Hoya throws. De La Hoya didn't have enough of a right hand to make it confusing for Floyd. Right? I don't believe Berlanga is that level of a fighter. Right? I know I'm sounding hard here. It is what it is. So, understand what happens in that Torres fight. Of course, Sheeraz does a lot of damage with that chopping right hand. Right? The fight ends up being stopped in the 5th round or so. Double check me on the footage. So understand what's going to happen here, folks. You have a fighter who's underrated. Right? You see him and you understand this is an elite talent. Right? Being loved has a lot of randomness to it. Right? You see some fighters who, have come up the hard way, don't have the Olympic gold medal, have sharpened their skills, really have worked on their game, are two-handed, as Sheeraz is. Right? Have a big punch, and for whatever reason, maybe it's his height, he's 6'3", right? He was 6'3", fighting at 160. The crowd just doesn't love them like they love, let's say, a Manny Pacquiao. Right? I lived through the 80s. For some reason, Marvin Hagler, who was respected, was not loved. And Hagler was doing things like going to South America, fighting Juan Rodin, fighting John the Beats Mugabe. He went to the UK to fight Alan Minter to win the title. He got jobbed in a fight against Vito Ortafermo, right? And you would have thought that the crowd would have said, hey, this guy's the real champ. He's the uncrowned champ. That's not what happened. Whereas Ray Leonard hardly fought, right? For legitimate reasons. That retinal surgery was major. Right? Ray hardly fought. The secret to Ray was when he did fight. It was, against Hearns. It was against other big names. Well, just understand. Also, Ray got knocked down in a fight. I believe it was Kevin Howard. No one talked about it. Right? We hold love fighters to different standards than we hold everyone else. So you have Hamza Shiraz, He's respected. He's not loved. He's fighting Edgar Berlanga in Berlanga's hometown, New York City, in a different country, in his first fight at 168 pounds. He's doing it the hard way. I suspect he'll never be loved like Ricky Hatton. He'll never be loved like Frank Bruno. He'll never be loved by Anthony Joshua. Right, folks? Buckle up. Here are the questions that need to be answered. What is Edgar Berlanga going to do to get by Sheeraz's jab? Folks, the fight won't start until Berlanga has an answer to that question. Let me also say this too. Carlos Adames moves well. This is the ever-ready bunny, right? Adames is always trying to bring it, right? This is the guy with buku stamina, right? Edgar Berlanga doesn't move as well as Carlos Adames. Let me say this. If Larry Holmes was a trainer and he was advising Hamza Shiraz, he would tell Sheeraz, player, why are you throwing anything other than that jab? It's like when you had Torres down off the jab, why were you taking the risk of trying to come in and get close in the pocket to throw a chopping right hand? If you're going to throw a right hand, make it an overhand long right hand. Right? Don't get close enough to the guy where the guy can counter you. But why are you throwing anything other than the jab to begin with? Right? With that level of jab, understand if you throw it and land it enough, the other guy's just going to fall down eventually. Right? Look at Holmes, Jerry Cooney. Right? And so, let me just say, how is Sheeraz going to treat his own right hand? Is he going to dare fate against a guy who hits awfully hard up close? Is he going to dare fate and get close to Berlanga to throw that chopping right hand of his? Right? All Berlanga needs is a knockdown of Sheeraz early, right? All he has to do is follow the Canelo blueprint, right? You know, Canelo knocked down Jaime Munguia. You understood he was in control. Canelo then coasts the plane and does enough to win the fight. Canelo knocked down Berlanga, takes his foot off the gas. He just lets the plane glide down the runway for the landing, right? He knocks down Jermell Charlo in the middle of the fight. Canelo is savvy. He knows to be busy enough after that. He's in control. The judges are not going to pick against Canelo in a fight where he gets the only knockdown. Folks, I don't believe this is a level playing field. You're fighting Berlanga in New York City. As I mentioned too, I was raised in Queens. There were a lot of Puerto Ricans in Queens. Also, understand New York City is a mass transit town. Right? Folks are going to take the 7 train to the fight. You're going to have a lot of Puerto Ricans from the Bronx and from Brooklyn at this fight. No question about it. Right? So this is really an unlevel playing field. All Berlanga has to do is land some big shots. Hurt Sheeraz, who's coming off a bad second half of his fight against Carlos Adames. Right? Think about the timing of this. Sheeraz gives a performance that had many in the UK thinking he lost to Adames. Right? His very next fight is 8 pounds up against the guy who's a slugger at 168. In that slugger's backyard. Right? Just ask yourself, what could possibly go wrong? So you should be able to know how this fight is going just from the distance between the two men. Let me say this too. If I'm Hamza Shiraz, I just privately say to myself, as good as my right hook is, and it's good, right? I'm not throwing it in the first 3-4 rounds of this fight because Sheeraz should have a decided advantage from distance since he's the one with ring coverage, right? He needs to shoot the jab. He needs to stay in the middle of the ring, right? Berlanga doesn't have awareness in terms of where he is in the ring. So Berlanga is going to be over by the ropes, right? Let me also say, too, when you have a good jab and you have the kind of, movement that Sheeraz has, you can tell Sheeraz is a lefty, right? His movement seems a little bit awkward. That works to his favor against an opponent who's not ready for it. Berlanga might not have the choice to stay in the middle of the ring because that jab is going to keep him away from the inside part of the pocket, right? He's going to have to necessarily be outside. Let me say this too. Berlanga, a lot of KOs early in his career. Not a lot of KOs in his recent fights, right? Wasn't that Canelo going the distance with Berlanga, right? Understand too, the personalities are interesting. Sometimes fighting at home is the worst thing that can happen to you, right? Berlanga fought Canelo. It wasn't in New York City. Canelo knocks him down, and Berlanga, who views himself as alpha, against a surefire first ballot Hall of Famer, a guy who's on the short list and has been on the short list for years of the very best pound for pound in the sport. Berlanga hits the canvas against Canelo. He's not the first. And he starts pounding the canvas while he's on the canvas to let you know, this guy knocked me down. It shouldn't have happened. Right? My bad. I made a mistake. How could I let this happen? Right? It wasn't I'm in the deep water. Right? I'm in against the Hall of Famer. Right? This guy hit me with a shot, dropped me, as he has so many others. Let me, swallow my pride, realize that I'm in the deep water part of the ocean. And let me, keep a clear head, be prepared to talk with the referee, let the ref know, hey man, I'm lucid, I can continue, and then find a way to stay away from a guy who just dropped me the rest of the round. Right? No, Berlanga really does view himself as alpha. So he's going to try to come looking for Hamza Shiraz. Folks, Sheeraz is a knockout puncher. Understand, his punching power doesn't translate on film. You see him throwing the jab, you say, oh, that's a stiff jab. You have no idea that he doesn't have to throw any other punches. Right? So I believe you need to ask the question, and it's going to be framed in the early rounds of this fight. How is Berlanga going to get past the jab? How is Berlanga going to get inside, period? Right? Also understand, too, you slip the jab. If you get inside, just recognize that Sheeraz has the right hand. Right? He gets a knockdown against Emmanuel Francisco Torres off a short right hook. Right? I'd prefer for him to throw more overhand rights. Look at Hearns against Roberto Duran. Right? Hearns doesn't give Duran a chance to fight inside in that fight. Right? Sheeraz, let's just say, had he not been hyper-aggressive after knocking down Torres, he would never have been knocked down himself. It's going to be a good fight. The first few rounds of this fight are going to be riveting. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.